She had survived 3 winters alone. This one was different. So was he. The thermometer read 14 below, and the woodpile was half what it should have been. Thomas Lane had lived on the next quarter section for 11 years and spoken maybe 40 words to her. But that Tuesday morning, she found 6 cedar posts stacked beside her west gate, still smelling of lantern oil and fresh-cut wood. Clara Weber stood at the west window of the house James built in 1879, her hands not idle. They never were. The left gripping the handle of a cast-iron skillet she'd just scraped clean, the right pressing a rag against its surface in slow circles. The dark auburn braid secured with rawhide hung past her shoulder blades and swayed once as she shifted her weight to look out past the barn with its patched south wall, past the fence line that ran straight for a quarter mile before it met the road, out toward the Bitterroots where the light was already going gray at 4 in the afternoon. 320 acres of high Montana grassland, every blade of it hers, every blade of it paid for. The flour-dusted, leather-bound ledger sat on the kitchen table behind her, its cracked spine facing up, open to October. She didn't need to look at it. She knew what it said. $47 property tax, paid 4 years running, never late, never short. Every cord of wood counted, every pound of flour tracked against what it produced. 75 cents per pie sold at the church supper and the general store. You do that math enough times and it becomes something harder than hope. It becomes fact. And Clara Weber trusted facts the way other women trusted prayer. James died of pneumonia in the winter of 1883, a Tuesday. She remembered that because she'd been rolling dough when his breathing stopped, and the dough had dried out by the time she came back to it, and she'd had to throw it away and start over. That was 11 years ago. The 4 grown children she raised after that were scattered now across 3 territories, sending letters and sometimes money she never cashed. She cashed the letters, read them twice, folded them back into their envelopes, and set them in the drawer beneath the ledger. Now, Tuesdays. Every Tuesday for 13 months, Clara Weber baked 4 apple pies. Not 3, not 5, 4. And the method mattered because the method was the woman. She started with butter, cold, pulled from the root cellar at dawn, hard enough to ring against the countertop when she set it down. She cut it into the flour with 2 knives, working in crosses, never touching it with her fingers because fingers are warm and warm butter makes flat crust. She cut until it looked like rough gravel, not sand, not pebbles, gravel, irregular, some pieces the size of peas, some smaller. Then ice water. 1 tablespoon at a time. She counted, never more than 6 tablespoons for a single crust, and if the dough held together when she pressed a handful into a ball, she stopped. Didn't matter if it looked dry, it would press out. It always did. The apples. Wine saps, bought by the bushel in September from the Hendricks orchard 40 miles south, she sliced a 1/4 inch thin, not an 1/8, which cooked to mush, not a 1/2, which stayed hard at the center when the crust was already browning, a 1/4 inch. She didn't measure with a ruler. She measured with 11 years of knowing what a 1/4 inch looked like when a knife passed through fruit, lattice woven, not laid. Every strip threaded over-under, pulled back and replaced, the pattern tight enough to hold the steam in, but open enough to let the top breathe golden. Cream brushed on with a cloth. Raw sugar dusted from 3 inches up so it fell even. 2 pies went to the general store, 75 cents each. 1 went to Ruth Ames, the old woman with the carved darkwood walking stick and the sharp brown eyes beneath thin gray brows, for free, because Ruth had sat with James's body while Clara finished the second batch of dough that Tuesday 11 years ago, and some debts don't have a dollar amount. 1 pie Clara kept. That was the routine. The routine was the armor. Folks in town asked how she was doing. She told them. Same 2 words every time. I'm managing. Said it to the pastor. Said it to the women at the church supper. Said it to Henry Caldwell when he rode up last spring with his sandy blonde hair and his hazel eyes and that folded land survey map poking out of his jacket pocket, asking if she'd considered selling the West 40. I'll think about it, she told him, which meant no. which he knew, which everyone knew. Before we go on, I want to know what country you're listening from today. Drop it in the comments. I see you out there. Now, here's what matters about what happened next. Thomas Lane owned the next quarter section east, had for 11 years. A widower longer than her, his wife gone before he ever came to Montana, as far as anyone knew. Broad-shouldered, tall, silver-gray hair perpetually hat-flattened, that brass pocket watch on a tarnished chain always in his left coat pocket. Pale blue eyes deep-set beneath heavy brows. In 4 years they had exchanged maybe 40 words, a nod at the general store. His fence line ran parallel to hers along the west boundary, close enough that on a still morning she could hear his hammer if he was setting posts. That October, frost came 2 weeks early. Clara checked the thermometer at dawn on the 14th, 26 degrees. She went to the ledger, pulled it open, picked up the pencil stub she kept in the spine, and wrote in her careful hand, 14 chords, need 22. She underlined it twice. The lines pressed hard enough to leave grooves on the page beneath. 8 chords short. 8 chords was a killing number, and she knew it. Then came Tuesday morning, October 21st. Clara walked to the west gate at first light to check the hinge she'd been meaning to replace, and stopped. 6 cedar posts, stacked flush against the gate post. Fresh cut, the ends pale and clean, still smelling of lantern oil from whoever had worked them by night. The bark stripped, the grain tight and straight. Old growth, not second cut. She stood there for a full minute. The morning was still enough that her breath hung in front of her face and didn't move. She reached down and picked one up, tested its weight, rolled it in her hands to feel the grain under her palms. Dense, good wood, cut by someone who knew what cedar was for and what it cost. She said nothing to anyone. The following Tuesday, Clara finds the west gate's broken hinge replaced. New iron, hand-forged, still warm from recent work, and boot prints in the frost that are too large to be hers. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second. Still warm, meaning whoever did this was here maybe 20 minutes before she walked out with her coffee. The iron itself, she ran her thumb across it, bore the uneven ridges of hand hammering, not the smooth press of factory stock. Someone had heated this piece, bent it over an anvil, punched the pinholes with a drift, and hung it on her gate while the sky was still black. The hinge pin sat flush, no wobble. The gate swung true on the first test, and the second, and the third. She tested it 3 times. That tells you everything. The boot prints pressed deep into the frost crust beside the gatepost. Size 12, square-toed, the kind of heavy work boot that costs real money and lasts a decade. The stride was long, a tall man's gait, unhurried. No drag marks, no second set of prints suggesting hesitation or pacing. He'd walked up, done the work, and walked away. Clara stood there with her dark auburn braid falling past her shoulder blades, the rawhide strip at its end catching the first gray light. Her gray-green eyes moved from the hinge to the prints to the tree line and back. Then she went inside, pulled the flour-dusted ledger from the kitchen table, opened it to the current page, and wrote in her careful, slanted hand, West Gate Hinge, replaced, unknown. She underlined unknown once. Then she closed the ledger and went about her morning. 4 days later, at Harmon's general store in town, Thomas Lane stood at the front counter counting out nails into a paper sack. 16 penny nails, 40 of them, and 2 spools of number 9 wire. He placed exact change on the counter, $1.20 and 1 dime, without looking up. His brass pocket watch hung on its tarnished chain from the left pocket of his charcoal wool coat, catching the lamp overhead. The clerk said, "Fixing fence?" Thomas said, "Always fixing fence." 4 words, that was all. His pale blue eyes stayed on the nails as he folded the top of the sack down twice, precise as a man wrapping a wound. His silver-gray hair lay flat where his battered gray felt hat had pressed it, the hat now held in his right hand against his thigh. Clara was 3 aisles back, running her finger along a shelf of canning jars. She did not look up, did not turn toward the sound of his voice. Her hand paused on a jar for exactly 1 second, then moved to the next. The clerk noticed. The clerk always noticed. He looked at Thomas's back, then at Clara's profile, then at the space between them, maybe 15 feet of pine floorboard and dry goods, and said nothing. In a town of 400 people, saying nothing is its own kind of sentence. Now, the reason I tell you that is because of what happened that Thursday morning on the north fence line. Overnight, frost had heaved the third post from the corner a full inch above grade. Clara found it at dawn, leaning east, the wire pulling slack on one side and biting into the wood on the other. She set down her coffee tin on the nearest flat rock and went to work. The soil on the north line is half clay, heavy red stuff that turns to concrete when it freezes, and soup when it thaws. She dug around the base with a short-handled spade, breaking through the frozen crust 2 inches down, then hitting the wet clay beneath that sucked at the blade with every stroke. The hole needed to be 18 inches deep for a corner-adjacent post. She cleared it to 16 before her hands went white at the knuckles. She repositioned the post. Cedar, 5 inches across, squared on 2 faces. She held it plumb by eye, sighting down the line toward the corner post, and began tamping, bootfuls of clay packed in layers, each one stamped down with the flat of the spade. But her hands were numb. The angle drifted. 2 degrees east, maybe 3. She could see it in the shadow line against the wire. She tamped it anyway, because the alternative was standing there with dead fingers arguing with physics. The next morning, the post was straight. She walked the line at first light and stopped cold. The post stood plumb, perfect vertical, not a degree of drift in any direction. Someone had pulled the clay, repacked the base with river gravel. She could see the gray-white stones through the topsoil, smooth and round, the size of walnuts, and retamped in layers over that. River gravel. The correct fix for frost heave in clay, because gravel drains and clay holds water and water expands when it freezes and pushes posts sideways. Everyone knows this. Not everyone does it at 3 in the morning for someone else's fence. Clara knelt. She touched the gravel with her bare hand. The stones were cold and smooth and perfectly placed. She said nothing, wrote nothing in the ledger that day. The following Wednesday, Ruth Ames sat at Clara's kitchen table. The old woman's carved walking stick leaned against the chair beside her, dark with decades of palm oil, and her dark green shawl was fastened at her throat with the bone pin she'd worn since before Clara was born. Her dark brown eyes, sharp, watchful, tracked Clara's hands as she cut 2 slices of apple pie. Ruth ate 3 bites before she spoke. Then she set her fork down and said, 11 years is a long time to be a good man for no one. Clara's hands did not stop moving. She wiped the counter. She folded the cloth. She set the pie back on the cooling rack. She did not respond. Ruth finished her slice in silence and tapped her way out the door. The next morning, a Wednesday, Clara set the kettle on the stove. She pulled 1 cup from the shelf. Then, without pause, she pulled down a second, set both beside the stove, poured the first, reached for the pot to pour the second, and stopped. She stared at that empty cup for 10 seconds. Then she picked it up, turned back to the pot, and poured the coffee back in. She wasn't ready yet, but her hands were. November brought Henry Caldwell up Clara's drive in a new buckboard with a land survey map and a smile that had too many teeth in it. Now look, I want to be fair to Henry Caldwell. He was 29 years old, sandy blonde hair parted on the left and falling just past his ears, hazel eyes with gold flecks that caught the light in a way women at church noticed. He had a dimple in his left cheek when he spoke. He had good land, 480 acres adjacent to Clara's north boundary, flat bottomland that wintered cattle without supplemental hay most years. He had polished tan boots and a brass belt buckle, and a folded land survey map always poking out of his inner jacket pocket, like a little flag announcing his intentions to anyone paying attention. He was not a bad man, but damn if he wasn't an annoying one. He stepped down from that buckboard with the survey map already unfolded, spreading it across his knee like Clara hadn't memorized every property line within 2 miles of her own fence. He pointed to her north 40 acres, the section that bordered his lower pasture, and he offered a fair price. Better than fair, actually. $12 an acre when the going rate was $9.50. Clara stood on her porch, dark auburn braid falling past her shoulder blades, the flour-dusted ledger tucked under her left arm. Her gray-green eyes looked at the map, then at Henry, then past Henry at something only she could see. The farm is not for sale. 5 words, no explanation, no softening. Henry folded the map back into his jacket pocket, and that dimple appeared because he smiled like a man who'd expected this answer and already planned his spring approach. "I'll ask again in spring," he said. She did not invite him to sit. Here's the thing about Henry Caldwell that made him dangerous. Not evil, not cruel, but dangerous in the way a river is dangerous when it's patient. He came back 3 days later. Same buckboard, same smile. This time he mentioned he could winter her cattle on his lower pasture, free of charge, no obligation, just neighborly. His pasture was overgrown anyway, he said. The cattle would be doing him a favor. Clara stood in the same spot, same posture, upright, chin slightly lifted, hands gripping the porch rail. "I'll think about it." She did not think about it, not once. Not for a single second between that moment and the church supper the following Sunday. The church supper in Elk Fork was held in the large hall behind the Methodist building. Pine tables arranged in 3 long rows, kerosene lamps hung from the crossbeams, every family bringing 1 dish and carrying home opinions about 6 others. The room held perhaps 80 people, and every one of them had eyes that tracked movement the way a hawk tracks a field mouse. Clara carried her pie, wine-sap apple, lattice woven not laid, cream brushed with raw sugar dusted across the top, to the last table at the far end. The table closest to the back door, where the draft came through and the lamplight barely reached. She set the pie down. She sat in the chair beside it. The chair on her other side remained empty. Henry Caldwell moved toward that empty chair. You could see it happen from across the room, the lean of his body, the angle of his polished boots turning, that survey map corner poking from his jacket like a declaration of intent. He made it 4 steps before old Ruth Ames tapped her carved walking stick against the floor. 2 sharp beats, and said something to Margaret Pruitt that made Margaret laugh loud enough to break Henry's trajectory. He veered, sat 2 tables away, spent the evening glancing. Thomas Lane sat at the first table near the door, broad shoulders in his charcoal wool coat, battered gray hat on the bench beside him. His pale blue eyes looked at his plate. He did not look at Clara's table. He did not look at the empty chair. He ate, spoke to no one beyond what courtesy required, and left before the pie was served. Ruth Ames watched him go. Her dark brown eyes, sharp beneath thin gray brows, tracked his deliberate gait through the door. She said nothing. The bone pin on her dark green shawl caught the lamplight as she turned back to her coffee. "Before we go on, I want to know, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. I think about you out there more than you know." Now, the reason I tell you that is because of what happened the following Tuesday. Clara walked out at first light and found her woodpile had grown by 2 cords overnight. Fresh, split pine, stacked tight against the west wall of her woodshed, every piece bark side up to shed water. The correct method. Not the fast method, the correct one. Someone had stood in her yard by lantern light, splitting and stacking with the bark oriented outward on every single piece so rain would run off the curved surface instead of soaking into the exposed grain. She counted. 214 pieces. She opened her flour-dusted ledger on the kitchen table and wrote the number in her careful hand. She did not write a name beside it. The shared boundary between Clara's land and Thomas Lane's ran along a quarter-mile ridge where the soil shifted from sandy loam to half clay. That Thursday, she walked the line checking her posts and found Thomas already there, 40 feet away on his side, replacing a post where frost heave had shifted it. His brass pocket watch chain caught the thin November sun. He drove the post with a maul, 3 strikes, checked the angle with his eye along the fence line. Perfect. She watched for perhaps 10 seconds, then turned to her own posts and said nothing. They worked 40 feet apart for an hour. Neither spoke. The only sound was the thud of maul on wood and the scrape of packed earth. The following week, he offered to help replace her 12 worst posts on the North Line. She said nothing for 6 full seconds, long enough that a lesser man would have filled the silence with justification. Thomas waited, hands hooked into his leather suspenders, pale blue eyes steady. "The holes need to be 30 inches in this soil," she said. He nodded. They started at the eastern end. First hole, he dug 26 inches and hit what he thought was the firm base layer. Clara looked at the depth from 4 feet away. The half clay in this section ran deeper than it appeared. Below 26 inches sat another 4 inches of mixedite clay that would expand when saturated, pushing the post upward with every freeze cycle. She knew this because she'd lost 3 posts to that exact layer 2 winters ago, and the ledger recorded each one. 4 inches deeper, she said. Not unkind, not apologetic, a fact. Thomas pulled the post, set it aside, and redug without comment. The shovel blade bit through the clay layer. Dense, gray-brown, resistant. He packed the post in layers, 6 inches of gravel, then clay tamped with the flat of the shovel handle, then gravel again. 30 inches. She checked the angle by sighting down the line. Correct. She did not correct him again. 12 posts. He drove the last one, the 12th, at the correct angle on his first attempt, set the point, aligned his eye down the fence line, swung the maul 3 times with his full weight behind it. The post sank true. Clara watched from 30 yards away, her ledger tucked under her arm, her gray-green eyes steady beneath straight, dark brows. She said nothing. She corrected nothing. And that silence was louder than anything she'd said all autumn. December arrived like a hand closing around the valley. The temperature dropped 19 degrees in a single night and did not come back up. Clara opened her flour-dusted, leather-bound ledger at the kitchen table before dawn on the 4th and wrote with a pencil that shook slightly against her fingers. December 4th. Temp, -22 at dawn. Wind NNW. Wood consumed, 1.3 cords per day. Projected supply, 9 days at current rate. Need 14. She underlined the last number twice, closed the cracked spine, set the pencil down with the kind of deliberateness that tells you a woman is doing math she does not like the answer to. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, not gray, not white, but that particular metallic nothing that means the clouds have swallowed every edge of the horizon and are not planning to give them back. The wind had shifted overnight from its usual westerly push to a hard, biting thing out of the north-northwest that found every gap in every wall and punished it. Snow did not fall so much as move sideways, driven horizontal, packing against the south face of every structure like plaster. First night, Clara pulled on her heavy canvas apron over her faded indigo wool dress, wrapped a scarf twice around her dark auburn braid, and went to the barn at 11 in the evening because waiting until morning was not something she could afford. 34 head. She counted them by lantern light, moving between the stalls and the open pen, her breath coming in clouds that froze against her eyelashes. The water trough, solid, ice 1.5 inches thick. She took the axe handle she kept hung on a nail by the door and drove it down 4 times, cracking through to the water beneath. The sound was sharp and flat in the cold, like breaking slate. Then the hay. She climbed the raised crib she had built last September. Cedar posts sunk 20 inches into packed gravel, the floor elevated 9 inches above ground level, the sides wrapped in oiled canvas she'd bought at 37 cents a yard and stitched herself. The hay was dry. Every bale she pulled down and broke apart smelled of summer still, golden and sweet against the iron-cold air. Her preparation paid off. She fed each section their allotment, measured by eye after years of practice, and noted the count in her head for the ledger. Second day. The south barn wall, the patch she had repaired in October with those cross braces, began to bow. She heard it before she saw it, a low groan in the timbers, a shifting sound that made her stomach drop. The problem was the wood. She had used what she had, which was green pine cut in late summer. It had been fine in October. It was not fine now. The cold had shrunk the green wood, pulling the joints apart by fractions of an inch that added up to gaps. The cross braces were loose in their notches. Snow load pressed against the wall from outside. Wind pressed from the north. The whole section flexed inward like a breathing thing. She needed dry hardwood braces, seasoned oak ideally, cut 8 months ago and stored under cover. She did not have them. There was no getting to town. There was no getting anywhere. Day 3. Clara walked into her barn at first light and found 4 dry oak braces leaning inside the door. Each one 8 feet long, squared on 2 sides, the ends already rough-cut at angles that suggested someone knew exactly what size her barn bays were. No footprints outside. The snow had filled them overnight, but she knew. She did not pause to feel anything about it. She worked. She measured the first bay with a length of rope she kept knotted at 1-foot intervals, cut the notch in the brace with a handsaw, working the blade slow because oak fights you. It does not splinter, it resists, and if you rush, you bind the blade and lose 20 minutes freeing it. She cut each notch a 1/4 inch shallow on purpose, then shaved it with a chisel until the fit was tight enough to hold by friction alone. Drove wooden pegs through pre-bored holes with a mallet, 2 pegs per joint, staggered so the grain of the peg crossed the grain of the brace. When she finished the first one, she pressed her full weight against it, all of her 5'4" square-shouldered frame leaning hard, and it did not move. Not a creak. She did the remaining 3 by lantern light that evening. The fence section that failed was the east line. 3 posts, the old ones she had not replaced. The frozen ground heaved them upward 2 inches, loosening their grip in the earth. Wire sagged. 2 cattle pushed through before dawn on day 5. Clara went out at -18 to drive them back. The wire in that cold becomes a different material entirely. It loses all forgiveness. It is brittle and sharp, and it cuts through leather work gloves like they are paper. Her hands were bleeding through the leather within 10 minutes. The cattle did not want to move. She moved them anyway. Thomas appeared at her east fence line without being asked. She saw him coming through the horizontal snow, his battered gray felt hat pulled low, his charcoal wool coat buttoned to the throat, the brass pocket watch chain catching what little light there was. He carried a sledge over one shoulder. He did not wave. He walked to the first shifted post and drove it back with 4 strikes, precise, heavy, the sound carrying flat across the frozen ground. He packed frozen gravel around the base with his boot, then his hands, layering it the way she had shown him once in autumn. He retensioned the wire with a fence tool, pulling it to the right degree of give, not singing tight, not slack, but that middle place where it flexes with wind without loosening the staples. They worked side by side for 40 minutes. She said, "The 3rd post needs another 6 inches of gravel." He said, "I know." These were the only words. At 2 a.m. on the 8th night of the storm, Clara hears the rhythmic crack of an axe outside her barn and looks through the frost window to see lantern light moving in the dark, and she does not go outside to stop him. That was the night something in her broke open. Not broke apart, broke open. There is a difference. The storm broke on the 11th day. Clara opened her ledger and wrote, "Wood remaining, 2, 1 cords. Cattle, all 34 head. Barn wall, holding. Fence, holding." Then she wrote one more line she had never written before. But first, the inventory. Because Clara Weber did not celebrate survival with relief, she celebrated it with numbers. The raised hay crib, the one Thomas had suggested building 18 inches off the ground on cross-laid pine runners, held every bale dry. She checked them herself that morning, pressing her palm flat into the center of each one, the way you check a loaf of bread. Cool, dry, no mold smell, no heat at the core. 34 head of cattle standing in her barn, every one accounted for, every one fed through 11 days of killing cold because that hay stayed off the ground. The north fence, those posts they'd reset together in September, the ones sunk 40 inches into half-clay soil and tamped in 4-inch layers of packed gravel and clay, held without a single lean. She walked the line in snow up to her shins, her dark auburn braid tucked inside her coat collar, and ran her hand along each post. Plumb. Every one. The barn wall with the dry oak braces, the repair that had failed the first time because she'd used green pine, and Thomas had said nothing until she noticed the bow herself, held against 11 days of wind that had taken shingles off roofs 3 miles away. What almost failed, the east section she hadn't replaced yet, 2 posts leaning 6 degrees off plumb, wire sagging enough that a determined cow could push through. She'd braced them with cedar rails on the 9th night, a temporary fix in horizontal snow. They held. Barely. And the wood. 2.1 cords remaining from a projected 0, because someone had split wood at 2 in the morning on the 8th night, because someone had stacked it against her barn wall where the overhang kept the snow off, because she had not gone outside to stop him. She sat at her kitchen table, the flour-dusted, leather-bound ledger open before her, its cracked spine flat against the wood, gray-green eyes steady. She wrote the line she had never written before. Thomas Lane. Ode. She stared at it, the pen still in her hand, the ink drying. She did not know what the debt was measured in, not dollars, not cords, not hours. She stared at those 2 words and the dash between them, and she closed the ledger without adding a unit of measurement. The town emerged slow, like animals after a flood, cautious, blinking, counting what remained. The Hendricks lost 12 head, 12 cattle dead because their hay sat on the ground and spoiled from moisture wicking up through frozen earth. 11 days of storm and no dry feed. The facts moved through the valley without commentary. Nobody said Clara's name. Nobody needed to. The Caldwell barn roof collapsed under snow weight on the 9th day. Henry had saved his horses but lost the structure. His fence held fine. His barn did not. These numbers traveled from kitchen to kitchen, from porch to porch, assembling themselves into a verdict nobody spoke aloud. 3 days after the storm broke, Henry Caldwell rode up Clara's road. He dismounted, sandy blonde hair pressed flat beneath his hat, that dimple absent because his mouth was set in a line. He walked, didn't ride, walked, to Clara's north fence line, the posts Thomas had helped set. He gripped one with both hands and pushed, full weight. The post did not move. He pressed his palm flat against the wire, testing tension the way you'd test a bowstring. Correct give. Not singing tight, not slack. He looked at the barn wall, the dry oak braces visible beneath the overhang. He stood there a long moment. Then he nodded once, mounted, rode away without speaking. That nod was the town's verdict. 2 weeks later, the county livestock inspector came through. A man named Farrell with a state-issued ledger of his own and no interest in stories. He checked Clara's barn temperature log. She'd recorded morning and evening readings for all 11 days. He counted cattle. 34. He tested fence tension on 3 sections. He read 3 pages of her ledger, running his finger down the columns of numbers. Hay consumed per day. Wood burned per day. Barn temperature at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. He said, 34 out of 34. That's better than anyone else in the valley this year. He wrote it in his own book. He left. That was all. But that was enough. Ruth Ames appeared at Clara's kitchen table one final time. Early March. Snow still on the ground, but the light different. Longer, softer at the edges. Ruth's carved dark-wood walking stick tapping 2 beats ahead of each step as she came through the door. Her dark brown eyes found the table immediately. 2 cups of coffee, both full, both steaming, one at Clara's place, one across from it. Ruth looked at those cups for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara, at her gray-green eyes, at the small, pale birthmark just below her left ear, at the face of a woman who had been alone for 11 years and was not alone anymore. "She hasn't made 2 cups since James," Ruth said. Clara said nothing, her hands still on the table. Ruth tapped her walking stick once on the floor, one sharp knock, and left. She said nothing else. She didn't need to. If this story is keeping you company tonight, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now, let me tell you how it ended. Clara walked to Thomas Lane's porch on a Tuesday in late March, the ground still frozen beneath thin snow. She stood there, hands at her sides, the flour-dusted ledger not with her for once. Just her faded indigo wool dress, her scuffed black boots on his porch boards. He came to the door, broad-shouldered, silver-gray hair hat flattened, that brass pocket watch on its tarnished chain, catching the last of the afternoon light from his left coat pocket. Pale blue eyes looking down at her from his full height. "Stay," she said. One word, standing on his porch with her chin slightly lifted the way it always was. Thomas says yes. One word, standing in her kitchen with snow still melting off his boots, and the narrator lets the silence hold for a full breath before continuing. They were married in April, in the large hall where the community gathered, with Ruth Ames in the front row tapping her walking stick against the floorboards in time with nothing anyone else could hear. The ceremony was spare, a minister who kept his remarks to 4 sentences. Clara wore her faded indigo wool dress, sleeves rolled to the forearm as always, her dark auburn braid falling past her shoulder blades with a single white wildflower tucked into the rawhide tie at its end. Thomas stood beside her in his charcoal wool coat, brass pocket watch chain catching the April light through the tall windows, his silver-gray hair pushed back and hat flattened, as if he'd only just remembered to remove it at the door. Which he had. On the kitchen table back at her homestead, the flour-dusted, leather-bound ledger sat open to a new page. At the top, in Clara's precise hand, a new column header, Lane Weber. Below it, nothing yet. The numbers would come, they always did. Ruth Ames leaned forward on her carved walking stick, dark brown eyes sharp beneath thin gray brows, and when Clara and Thomas turned to face the room as married, Ruth said nothing at all. She just stopped tapping. And that silence from her was louder than any applause. Henry Caldwell was there. I'll give him that. He stood near the back, sandy blonde hair parted on the left, the folded land survey map corner protruding from his tan canvas jacket as always. He did not clap. He did not scowl. He watched Thomas's hand find Clara's, and he nodded once. The same nod he'd given that fence post after the storm, the one that held when his own hadn't. Then he left before the pie was served. Good. Some people earn the right to leave quietly. Now, the joining of the land. 640 acres. Her 320 and his 320, and between them a fence line that had stood for 11 years. Cedar posts, weathered silver, wires strung tight, every post plumb because Clara Weber did not build crooked fences. But a boundary between husband and wife is no boundary at all. It's just posts in the ground with no purpose left. Thomas pulled the first one. He gripped it at the base where it met soil, rocked it forward and back the way you loosen a tooth, feeling for the give in the packed clay. 11 years of frost heave and settling had locked it deep. He worked it in a circle, widening the hole's grip, until the post came free with a sound like a cork from a bottle, that soft, wet release of earth letting go of something it had held a long time. Clara stacked the wire. She wore her heavy canvas apron and dark brown leather gloves, unclipping each strand from its staple, coiling it in loops over her forearm the way her father had taught her. 16-inch loops, never wider, so the coil stays manageable and doesn't spring. Post by post, they worked down the line, him pulling, her coiling. The fence between them disappearing into a neat stack of cedar and a drum of wire that would find new purpose elsewhere. They finished by evening. The line where 2 properties had been was just a row of holes in the earth, already filling with loose soil blown by the April wind. By morning, you wouldn't know it had been there at all. 5 years later. The barn wall stands solid, oak braces darkened by seasons to the color of molasses, the grain raised by rain and sun into ridges you can feel under your palm like a topographic map. The north fence, those posts Thomas set during the blizzard, the ones he drove by lantern light with snow driving horizontal, They've weathered gray but stand perfectly plumb. Every single one. You can sight down that line from the gate and not find a degree of drift. The ledger has 2 hands writing in it now. Hers precise, slanted slightly right, numbers tight and clean. His blocky, upright, pressed hard enough to dent the page beneath. They track different things. She records hay stores, payments, temperatures morning and evening. He records fence inspections, hoof conditions, water levels in the creek. Together, the pages tell a story that no single voice could. Before we go on, if this story has been keeping you company tonight, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now, the reason I tell you that is because of what happened on a Tuesday. It is a Tuesday. 5 years married and Clara is baking apple pie. The method has not changed. Cold butter cut with 2 knives until it looks like rough gravel. Not fine sand, never fine sand. Ice water added 1 tablespoon at a time, the dough pressed together but never kneaded because kneading builds gluten and gluten makes leather, not pastry. Winesap apples sliced a 1/4 inch thin, no thicker, fanned in the dish so they cook even. Lattice woven, over, under, not laid flat because woven lattice lets steam escape and flat lattice traps it and turns your bottom crust to paste. Cream brushed across the top. Raw sugar dusted from her fingertips. Thomas comes through the kitchen door. His heavy brown leather boots leave no mud. It hasn't rained in a week. The brass pocket watch chain catches late afternoon light. He says nothing. She does not look up. 2 cups of coffee sit by the stove, full and steaming, and neither of them remembers when that stopped being strange. The porch at sunset. 2 cups on the rail, steam rising into the evening air that smells of sage and cooling earth, and the last of the apple pie through the open kitchen window. Clara sits in the chair on the left, her gray-green eyes watching the light go gold across 640 acres that answer to one name now. A hand, weathered, steady, familiar, reaches across the space between the chairs and finds another, holds it, does not squeeze, does not pull, just holds. She had survived 3 winters alone. She did not need to survive a 4th. Not because she couldn't, because she didn't want to. And there is no shame in that. There never was. May God bless each and every one of you who listen today. Until next time, keep writing.